time, weather, and always class.
Welcome to the Chey and Pav podcast experience.
Okay, so
You're listening to the Chey and Pav Show, Teachers Talking Teaching. We are two middle school teachers sharing our reflections and insights about the topics that matter the most in the classroom. Join us in the hallway, the parking lot, or even in the staff room. Welcome to episode 127 of the Chey and Pav Show. Thank you for joining us as we sit around the table to talk teaching. We are having a dynamic and informative conversation today with Judy McKeown, anti-racist educator, consultant, and facilitator. We will talk to Judy about her experience with anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-colonial, and culturally responsive and relevant pedagogies, as well as her work in dismantling anti-Black racism, combating white supremacy culture, and leading with an equitable stance. Before we get into this conversation, though, please allow us to introduce ourselves. I am Pav, half of the Chey and Pav team. My teammate, and some would say he who needs no introduction, is sitting next to me. I'll give him a moment to say hello.
Hot town, summer in the city, Chey and Pav are about to get pretty.
Ooh.
One of us that's tougher than the other, but it can be done. And I am Chey, the Hurricane Cheney. I guess one half. I mean, I'm not the math teacher, so I'll take your word for it, 50-50, but I doubt it.
Yeah, it's pretty 50-50.
And Pav, you are right. We have a wonderful, powerful, invigorating conversation here today, and I can't wait to get right into it. But as much as I can't wait to get right into it, we're not about to get right into it. We're about to have some chit-chat.
That's right. We never are. As they say, it's banter time.
They? Who's they? They's you.
That's me.
You're the only one who puts it in the show notes. See, in a subsection, banter.
Banter with an asterisk around it.
And then you always go, Chey starts. There's always this pressure that I need to come up with these banter talking points.
But you always do, so easily.
This is true, and I got a couple.
Yeah,
one.
Good. See, you're ready.
Yeah, that's right. It's the flip of the coin. Mm-hmm. The message or the hooray message.
Oh, we'll start with the bad news.
Well, we have got into summertime, and we have survived our I almost felt like saying 8 months, but 8 weeks as supply teachers put back out into the system to sort of help with the shortages. And I must say,
it felt like 8 months.
It felt like 8 months.
Yeah.
In my 21 years of teaching, it was the toughest 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And I said, it's not because an adult wanted to be mean to me or a student wanted to be mean to me, but ultimately I was a visitor in a space, and I was just plugging holes daily. I taught everything. I have no business teaching middle school French, but I did it a few times. And so in the long run, it was a real strain. So I have an utmost appreciation for what occasional teachers are going through when they go into spaces. Now, I would argue that we didn't get the choice to go in. I think one of the strenuous parts of this, Pav, was finding out 5 minutes 7 minutes into the day, 5 minutes before the day, what you were doing. And you just felt like you were walking on eggshells, so anxious. I never would lose sleep waking up early, worry about what I was going to do, but I had no idea. And I had a great school, and the administrators and the teachers helped me as much as they could, but I couldn't get past that stressfulness. And it was tough, 8 grueling weeks. And I'm probably reinvigorated to be back teaching grade 8 next year, back away
Yeah.
from this 6 month hiatus as essentially assigned coach.
It was, I have to agree with you, Chey. It was the longest 8 weeks of my entire career of teaching. And for many of the same reasons that you outlined, it was just not having any sort of preparation for what we were getting ourselves into on a daily basis, finding out what you're doing a few minutes before the day begins, losing sleep over it, the dreams and the nightmares that I had over this 2 months were just, it was definitely an anxious time. And then, you know, as much as we spent time, because we did spend time preparing, got my, you know, bag of tricks ready for, you know, whatever the day would throw at me. But when you don't have very much time to prepare before you enter a space, it doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to get those things ready to deliver to the class for the day.
I would
And
like to jump in,
Yeah.
Pav, because I think some of the learning I did here is that often from afar, we just place that if you have piece A, B, and C, kids will respond.
Right.
And I would not go into, some of the spaces didn't go very well, but I never went into a space without having an arsenal of amazing
That's right.
lessons and activities, short, middle, long range, tech-driven, non-tech driven, that were just at my disposal to use. I figured these would be enough. And I think from afar, you create this false narrative that if I just have these elite tasks, kids will do them. They will not.
They will not.
They will absolutely not. There will be a few.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things I had to learn quickly is that being really prepared didn't help me because the relationships weren't there and the dynamic was, whether students knew it or not, was different.
Yeah.
And so it's a real reminder that those unicorns you have, I think from afar, you think that if you give a teacher a few tools that everything will magically change in a room is complete and utter fallacy.
No, it is an utter fallacy. And something that wasn't working in our favor is that it was the last 8 weeks of the year, right? And so students are, not to say that they are checked out, but they're getting closer to the summer. It's close to report card time. And so they know the way that things work. And they're a little bit not into it. They're not into it. So even if you do come in with like all the charisma that the teaching profession has to offer you, and you bring in all of the tools that you have prepared, the books, the excerpts, the videos, the excitement that you bring into a space, you could walk in and maybe 5% of the class is interested in what you have to say. The rest of them are thinking, my teacher is not here right now. And that is it. And so it was a challenge working through that. I was a little lucky is that I took on a 0.5, so half a day, long-term covering a class that was supposed to be temporary for a couple of weeks, but it ended up lasting the entire 8 weeks that I was there. And so I saw the same students. It was a rotary. It was a prep coverage role. So I would see the same 6 classes every morning. And so they got to know me, and I saw them twice a week. They got to know me. I got to know them. It was really lovely. I could prepare.
You got thank you cards at the end of the year.
I did. And I was not at all expecting that, but it was very lovely to receive some thank you notes from students at the end of the year, and students who were genuinely upset that I wasn't going to be at the school the following year, that I was going to be going back to my home school. And just like you, Chey, I will be back in the classroom in September, and I'm very, very excited for having the opportunity to do that and to utilize many of the things that I've learned over this past year and actualize them in the classroom. So that is a very exciting thing.
I'm excited to be teaching again next year.
Yeah.
From the learning I got as a coach, but also the learning in those 8 weeks. And I look forward to maintaining some of the relationships built in those spaces. As much as we sort of talked about how tough it was, there were still valuable connections made. And I know there's 4 or 5 teachers that I will readily stay in connection with to keep collaborating and building our capacity together.
Right. And the schools that we were serving in this particular role, I'd love to stay in contact with them. We started projects and meaningful projects in those spaces, things that we didn't have the opportunity, unfortunately, to see through. And so I'm very excited to maintain those relationships with those schools and see how they are doing with some of the things that they were very excited to start up with. And so I'm very happy to continue that support there.
All right, Pav, the good news now before we get into this Judy conversation.
Yes. Excitement.
And so I am here to thank, congratulate, and honor Pav Wonder for the board-wide Driving Innovation Excellence Award winner, the board's sole winner of this award.
What button here is the cheer?
Oh, hold on. I don't know if cheer's actually on this panel. It's actually not on this panel.
Oh, it's not on this panel.
But
okay.
being an editing expert like you are,
I will throw one in there.
Throw in the cheer and the drum roll. Pav, you were honored this year for your amazing work that you were doing as a coach, bringing podcast spaces and content creation spaces into a multiple of schools, the ones you were working with directly, indirectly, and ones that just heard about the work you were doing through word of mouth, and you got into schools. And when you think about how can a coach really impact this massive infrastructure, I said that in that moment, you are the model text for how a coach can have lasting, substantial impact and change capacity and learning styles for all. So congratulations on that stunning and amazing achievement this year.
Amazing. Thank you, Chey. I honestly did not know that was the good news that you were going to share. So I was like getting ready. Oh, what is he going to share? What is he going to share? I am touched. Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful shout out.
You're welcome. Option 2 was me sharing that I got a haircut. But I just weighed them. I said, haircut award. And then I went with award at the last second.
Amazing. Thank you. It has been the year that we had really did give us the opportunity to do some of course, the work that we are there to do, but also able to support in some of our own professional development that we have obtained over the last few years, and especially through this incredible work that we've been able to do with podcasting, storytelling, exploring oral traditions, and embedding that work into the curriculum and what we do every day to honor student identities and appreciate students and the voices that they already have and help them to amplify them with the work that we are doing. So I was absolutely honored and humbled to just be able to do that work in the spaces, and to see that schools were reaching out to us and asking us for help in setting up their spaces. They've seen what we have been doing, and just being able to reach out to us and us being able to help. I think that in itself was an absolute honor, and to be honored and observed with this award at the end of the year was just a little icing on the cake, a little cherry on top that helped to solidify the incredible work that we were doing this year. So thank you again for that shout out, and thank you for everyone who has shown love over the last little while on social media and in person in regards to this. It really is very humbling. I'm not great at receiving. So it is just, it's difficult for me to sit and say thank you. But
doing a good job thus
very
far.
Appreciative of it. Absolutely. So let's stop talking about me and move on.
So tell me, what did the plaque feel like?
Actually, I have it right here. It's bigger than I thought it was going to be. It's nice, very nice. Need to find a place on the wall for it.
You absolutely need to get that up on the wall. And again, congratulations. And it's been hot time. Let's get ready for this podcast episode with Judy, this riveting conversation, because we know that content is hot as the weather. And we'll be right back to the Chey and Pav Show.
Get your hands up to the floor.
And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show.
All right, Judy, thank you so much for sitting down to chat with Chey and myself today. We're truly honored that you've gifted us your time this evening. We're doing something a tad unorthodox tonight because I'm never the one to initiate the interview. That's always Chey's job, but I assure you that there is some method to our madness tonight. I wanted to start by asking you to share with our listeners a little bit about yourself. Tell us who Judy McKeown is, your role in education, and your story of your journey in education. So let's start off tonight by just telling us who you are a little bit. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for inviting me. I love what I see of the work that you share, the energy and the insight. So for me, it's an honor to be here. So first, I want to say that. In terms of me, so for me, I'm a secondary English teacher, and I always am like, okay, like even as I'm in different roles, like I was in a union role, I'm currently in a resource role, but I always kind of identify myself as like a secondary English teacher because that's kind of, that's like my, I don't want to say passion, but again, it's kind of how I always see myself, regardless of which role I'm in. That's kind of always the lens or the stance that I speak from. But when I think about my journey and I think about the inspiration, it all started back in grade 10. And we were reading Romeo and Juliet. We were going to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And even though I was only 15 years old, I kind of thought to myself, like, there has to be a better way or a different way to explore, English, right, as a subject area. So for me, it kind of started me thinking about, okay, what do I want to do as I move into, I was in the so-called advanced stream. So I was kind of thinking, okay, so what do I do next? And I think that's kind of where my inspiration started, was thinking, okay, I have to be that person who can go in and make some changes. And so that really is the start of my journey. And then now I'm currently in a resource role. And the focus really is in terms of like, how do we foster or create environments where students feel that they can empower themselves and where they can have agency and ownership over their own learning. So for me, it's a huge, like for me, like I'm very equity focused, and I just kind of see how, the whole idea of like equity seeking groups, as well as having opportunities to, again, create environments where students are taking that agency, has been really important for me. And I've learned so much in the past few years being in resource roles. And I think people don't think how much you actually learn by being in the roles, because people sometimes see you as the expert, as somebody who's like, going to teach them. But oftentimes you're learning just as much, from other educators and just from like the professional learning opportunities you get. So that's kind of where I am right now.
That's a wonderful response, Judy. I did give a little look to Pav when you identified as a high school English teacher, because Pav and I have always joked that if there are people that challenge us or push us or mock us, I said it's always a high school English teacher. And that was solved once I downloaded Grammarly, and it seemed to eradicate a lot of the issues. Of course, this is all just tongue in cheek. Thank you for that insight. And I know Pav and I, sometimes when we talk broadly about teaching or education, I think sometimes we're always mindful of the high school space being the same and similar and part of the journey, yet also distinctly different. I know, and this is not the topic of our conversation, but maybe you can jump in on this, and you'll learn very quickly that I speak randomly in all kinds of different things, and you extract anything you want to talk on, and there'll be a question hidden in there somewhere. And so as a grade 8 teacher, I've often had the responsibility of guiding students into high school. Guiding, you take how you want that to mean, part of the process. And it was interesting that an observation Pav and I've had is that they would often bring grade 8 teachers into high school spaces and be told exactly what we're not doing or what we need to do in order to prepare for high school. And I sort of took it all in. And towards the end of my career, I said, wait a second, no one's ever asked me the opposite. What could high school possibly do to bridge this gap? Why are we seeing or perceived issues that students are coming unprepared? And I said, but no high school teachers ever asked me, what is it that I'm doing? What is it that I see? What is it that I'm working that maybe they can try to integrate? It's always been a one-way dialogue of how can you change the way you're teaching in order to meet the needs that we have. And I think I don't blame a particular person. I often think of my own journey where for 15 years I just absorbed that and acted upon it. Mm-hmm. And then towards the end, I said, hold on a second. I actually know what I'm doing in grade 8. Maybe it's not just me not preparing kids for why you're so agitated on the other end. So we don't necessarily need to comment on that, but you can if you want. And then I'll have a series of high school teachers emailing me again.
Yeah.
But
they're going to be emailing me too, because I have to say they may not like.
Okay, so you can answer that, but I do want to frame one question, and it's sort of an anecdote, because when Pav and I sort of curate who our guests are going to be, we're always looking for an inspirational comment that drew us to, in your case, your work, or they're writing a poignant article or a poignant book, and we know directly as teachers we can learn and benefit from those conversations. And for me, I remember, you have these moments where you are. I remember where I was when I was listening to you on Clint Decline, the Anti-Racist Book Club podcast. And I was at my daughter's soccer, sitting in the car because it was way too cold for me to go out and watch. She could do whatever she wants. And I remember you coming on and talking about institutions that think they're doing anti-racist work, but ultimately they're just add-ons, they're just pieces, and in fact giving the system an entire pass on doing the work because it's an add-on, and it instantaneously stuck with me, and instantaneously I started to disrupt things that I was doing because I realized that's the type of anti-racism work I'm doing. I'm never challenging the system, I'm bringing in new things, bringing in new pieces. And I said, but ultimately, as I pat myself on the shoulder, not really, but as I symbolically pat myself on the shoulder, I'm actually giving these institutions complete and utter passes. And so when you made that statement, it was so impactful to me. I remember texting Pav right away, and this is a long time ago. I said, we need Judy on the show. We need Judy on the show because this statement is going to change me. And I think as a teacher, what are the 10 moments, the 12 moments, the books or something that really gave you a real shift? And your words in that particular moment really shifted me as a teacher and made me really think, when you think the systems are doing good work, and I don't know, maybe they are doing good work, but if they've got a root, a foundation, and a core that we know is systemically racist in its outcomes, whether you're thinking about data, but we know it's systemically racist, and we just add pieces on, then ultimately we're not changing the foundations of that system. And for me, when you said that, that landed so powerfully on me. And I would love for you to comment on that, maybe articulate how I've misinterpreted or maybe interpreted right, or how can teachers act upon that? And if you want to talk about that high school transition stuff, I can't wait.
I have to. Okay. So before I dig into the anti-racist part, I think it's so interesting because like in my role now, it's a K to 12 role, right? So I have opportunities to speak with, so many educators from different, who are teaching different grades. And when I do talk to like middle school or even, elementary, I do get that sense that people feel that they're preparing kids for high school. And then I always tell them it's like me believing that I'm actually preparing students for the workplace, for apprenticeship, for university, for college. I'm not, right? Like I think we have to start understanding that we have them where they are, and we have to do work that is developmentally and age appropriate and like specific to the context, specific to the students that are in front of us versus this whole idea of preparing. It's such a misnomer. And then when we get so caught up in that, I think we're focusing on like standards, or we're focusing on things that really are not as specific to, like I said, the people who are in front of us. So I always encourage people to think about like just what you're doing, do what you're doing very well, and have conversations. And it has to be a dialogue, right? It has to be a two-way street. And it's exactly what you say. It's not like, oh, we're coming down to find out like, what are you doing? And how come the kids come to us unprepared? Well, there are different kids. There are different types of learners. And I think that as secondary, we can learn so much. Like, it's so funny, the frenzy around is streaming. And if you speak to any elementary educator, they're like, hi, that's how we do it, right? So I feel like maybe we need to have more of those conversations of like what's going well in your grade 8 classroom that we can continue to do in secondary, so students are not like, they're not kind of shocked when they enter the space, right? Versus saying you need to have the students prepared for what we're going to do, because sometimes like we actually are the ones who need to change our practice, right? So I just feel like there needs to be way more honest dialogue about what's going on versus that, that because it sounds a little bit deficit to kind of come to someone and say, hey, this is what you're doing wrong. This is what you need to do to prepare the kids for us, versus saying, hey, what can we do to make that transition smoother? How can we work together? So that's my first piece. I had to get to that because my eyes have been completely opened, over the past couple of years. But okay, so now in terms of the anti-racist podcast, it's so funny because when people are like, oh, you said this, I'm like, I did? I said that? I'm like, okay, like, is that a bad thing? But I think for me, the reason why I have that whole concept of add-on is because I think sometimes when we look at things as add-ons, like it's still a form of like, how are we integrating, right? Because whenever you're adding something on, it's a form of marginalization because you're still centering what you think is important. So you're like, if you're like the curriculum, right? Like the curriculum, we need to focus on the curriculum, and then we'll just add some layers of anti-racism, or we'll add some layers of equity like around it. But like what's really important is the structure that we've had in place for like 100 years, right? And so then for me, it's so clear that like what's happening there is kind of surface level, right? Like it's almost like this is what it looks like. It's almost like a bit of a window dressing. And I think that that in itself becomes racist because what you're doing is you're still validating those racist systems instead of, kind of completely dismantling them and saying, hey, we need a different approach, right? And I think what's really important for me is like when I did that podcast, I was kind of reading, because again, I had come across like Dr. Carl James and Dr. Day's work, like when I was first starting, like in my first year of university, because I was really focused on like the issues that were happening in Ontario education, which is why I wanted to be a teacher. And but of course, you forget some of the tenets. So when I was preparing for that, and I looked and I read not just the section I was responsible for, but like the initial section, and it had like the 10 tenets of anti-racism or the 10 principles. And again, like what Day talks about a lot is that it's an action oriented like framework. It's not just meant to say, hey, if you just add a little bit of diversity, if you make sure students feel like there's representation, then you're good to go. And the thing is, it's not to say that those things are not important, because they are crucial. But again, like you're not actually changing the system, right? Like you're not, and that's what anti-racism is about. It's about, kind of flipping it, where the students are not like the vessels that need to be poured into or fixed. It's the system, right? And that's like, even if you think about like Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she talks about like an education debt versus like learning gaps, right? Like, so we're so used to like certain language. And I think when we kind of engage in the work of like these different theorists, we begin to kind of reframe our own understanding of like, how are we using language and how does that reinforce some of these things? So I think for me, add on is like I just feel like that's sometimes what we do.
Thank you, Judy. That's it's so insightful, and I have to agree with Chey that when we were both listening at the same time, and that was a point for both of us. That was just a huge shift in the way that we saw things. And I know that there has been lots of conversations around decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing education, and what does that actually look like? And that's what you're describing right here. It's not just tacking things on to the way that we have always done things and we will continue to do things. It's now looking into the system to say, well, where is this the most anti-racist, or where is this system perpetuating the same racist norms that it always has been? And so how can we instill those changes in order to make things different and make things better? And so I think that for us, that was a big point. So thank you for deconstructing that for us and telling us a little bit more about that. And I wanted to go back to your conversation just around the transition partnerships. It's very refreshing to hear that, there are high school teachers, and I'm not saying that they don't exist, but everything that we have always heard has been about preparing kids. And I think that in my role, in Chey and I are middle year student success counselors, so we're a little bit outside of having our own classroom spaces, but we work with a lot of teachers, and it's still very much the same thing that we hear from teachers that we are working with. Like, I need to prepare them for high school. I need to get through the curriculum. I need to get through the standards. I need to do this. But I've never really had that urgency when I was a classroom teacher to make sure that they had all of the curriculum that, the grade 8 curriculum down pat before they head to grade 9. I always was thinking about, well, have I prepared them enough as a learner? Have I instilled in them the things that they need to do to be able to continue learning when they get to grade 9, right? Have I prepared them for that? Have I given them the opportunity to explore their own voice and agency, as you were talking about as well? Have they figured out who they are as learners, and are they going to be able to continue that when they get into grade 9? Have I enabled them enough to be able to do that on their own? And I think that essentially is the most important piece. So if you are doing that with your grade 8s and grade 7s, then whatever they get thrown at when they get to high school is going to be just perfect. It's going to be great because they're going to be able to handle it. So I just wanted to add that little piece because that's definitely something that sticks in my mind. Chey, you wanted to add something?
Pav, I love what you were saying, and Judy, as you as well. But I love that point where you talked about it's not students that get through all the curriculum; it's teachers that get through all the curriculum. It's something
Yeah.
we put that. It's like on our foot or our helmet. It's our little sticker on our football helmet saying we did a great play. We got through the curriculum. And Pav, when you saw that, I had that aha moment because I was trying to convince a younger teacher. She was feeling so much pressure to get the curriculum done. I said, if you go through 60% of the curriculum, but the students have an enjoyable experience learning, they have a positive lens to which they see the learning space. I said they will, you don't want to say erroneously they'll pick it up, but they will pick it up. A commitment to learning and learning to learn and enjoy learning. I said, you as a teacher, be more comfortable with that. I said, think of all the lessons you come back to. You're just rushing through curriculum so you feel you've done your job, but ultimately we're letting so many kids get through because the kids that can pick up all the curriculum will pick up all the curriculum regardless of whether I'm there or not. They've already got every benefit to their. It's about making sure that every student walks away with something positive. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Pav, see, this is what happens when you throw the questions around. He's mixed up a little bit. This is what happened right here.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Chey, because I can keep it on track.
But I have to, I know
yeah.
that we're moving on, but I just feel like for me, I just, again, I use my own experience and I say, like, I know, like, for example, if I'm teaching like a grade 12 university preparation class, I'm like, well, what am I preparing them for? The majority of
Yeah.
students aren't going into English. I don't know which university they're going to go to. I don't know if they're going to even be in the country. So that whole idea that we're preparing, I think we need to get rid of that idea. I will only speak for my own curriculum because then there are going to be people who are going to say, well, in science and math and, and I don't want to get into that debate. But like when I think about a skills-based curriculum like English, as long as I am building in those skills that can be transferable to whatever they choose to go into, that's how I feel, right? Like, I'm like, if they, like you said, if they are enjoying, if they're interested in, if they have like a thirst for knowledge, even if it's in their own field, then I feel okay. I feel satisfied versus that whole idea of like, did I go through all the specific expectations, even though I really just need to go for the overall, right? Like those
That's
types
right.
of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I think about my own experience as a learner, like I definitely didn't have that. I was an okay student, but I was a compliance student. I was just doing it because I knew I had to. I would get in trouble if I didn't. I didn't like being in trouble. And so I just did it, but I wasn't really absorbing anything. Like Chey and I talk about this all the time. Like if we were to go back to school now, we would crush it because we love it. Right? Like we're really enjoying learning now. Whereas when we were young, perhaps, it wasn't something that we wanted to do. And we were just doing it to check off our own boxes because the teacher needs X, Y, and Z. And my report card's going to go home. And, I'm not going to get whatever thing I've been pining for and from my parents or whatever the case may be. When you're older, it's a different thing. You're trying to get into university. I need this grade. I need this. I need this. But yeah, I think that if I had that joy and that love of learning instilled in me at a younger age, I think that things would have been a little bit different, especially, when you're struggling through certain times during your life and university and high school, whenever it is. But anyway, we digress. And getting back to the conversation, and Judy, we listened to you initially on the Anti-Racist Reads podcast, but we also have been following you on social media, and we have been since then, and we've seen you put out such incredible work and incredible resources for teachers who are doing the work, anti-racist work, anti-oppression work, equity work in their classroom spaces. And we ourselves have used many of the frameworks and exit tickets and things that you have put out for teachers to use. So we want to know a little bit about where that need to put out those resources and make them so widely accessible. What was the inspiration behind that? What were you seeing or potentially not seeing in that social media space in terms of making these types of resources readily accessible for teachers to be able to use?
Well, there are a couple of things, but I think the first thing for me is that I noticed that there's a lot of reliance on like these external like resources, right? From books, and they do tend to be like from the United States, and that's not a critique. But the thing is, sometimes we try to transfer something that is like, it's not the right context. It's not the right, sometimes it's not even the right language, right? Like, so again, sometimes it becomes confusing. And I even did it by calling things standards versus, like, for example, expectations, right? Like, so again, sometimes the terminology is different. And I think for me, I just felt like, you know what, we don't honor lived experience enough, right? So I think that every time we're just focusing on a book, like a template from a book, or like a lesson plan from a book, and then it's like, well, this is in a United States context. Like, again, some people are going to do the work and they're going to tweak it, they're going to change it, but others are going to just use it just as it is. And I thought to myself, you know what, how can we be responsive, right? So if I'm doing something, or if I'm thinking something up and I'm like, I think this could be useful for people, I'm going to share it. And then the other thing is I've had, like, in my, I guess my past 3 roles, 3 roles in 3 years, I've had, like, the opportunity to work with teachers who will just tell me, like, this is what I want. And in the past, like, as a classroom teacher, you don't really have time necessarily to create certain, like, you might be able to create like an assignment, but, like, are you going to have time to, like, create like a template for a lesson plan, or like a checklist of some sort, right? Like, I didn't do those things when I was just focused on the classroom. I was focusing completely on, like, what I could do for my students. But finally, being in a role where I'm supporting, like, educators, I had the unique opportunity to do that. And I would go and I would make some, like, someone would be like, oh, can you do this for, like, the tech and the arts? And I'd be like, what you've asked for is really unique, but, like, how could I broaden it so I could just create something completely, from this idea, but I could share it with everybody. So a lot of the inspiration, like I said before, is really coming from actual classroom teachers who are saying, I need this because I know, like, when I'm working with my department, they really want to do things, but they don't have a reference point to kind of infuse anti-racist education into their classroom, or they're not really understanding culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So, like, how could you create a checklist, right? So again, I'm not always a fan of checklists, but if that's what somebody asks for, I'm like, I'm going to try to do it in the most critical way. And then I'm just like, what's the point of creating something for one department in one school when so many other people might be able to benefit from it? So I think that's kind of where it came from. And then sometimes when it's not like a direct ask or request from a teacher, sometimes when you have those opportunities where you're like, okay, I'm in between, like, doing certain things, and I actually have time where I could create a resource, I think, okay, what could make people's lives a little bit easier in terms of, like, different entry points, right? Because not everything is going to be 101, right? Like, I'm not always saying, hey, let's always start at 101, but there are other people who, there's a whole, like, continuum of where we can start. So I kind of think of, okay, what is missing? What could be that spark for somebody where they're going to make a change in their classroom, but it's accessible and it's available. So that's kind of my rationale for kind of just sharing widely.
Judy, that's a great response. As you were telling that story, it reminds me of conversations Pav and I had when we talked about those great resources you were showing. Is that when we look in the social media space, when a lot of the time when teachers talk about their social justice work, it's a courageous conversation. And I've always said the courageous conversation. I, as a teacher, was big on conversation, but as I grew a little bit older, I realized I walked away from the space thinking everyone had engaged in the courageous conversation, but no, I had, and 3 other people had. And I said, if your social justice work is always just about a conversation, sort of an ad lib conversation, I said, how many folks are really getting something out of that space? And then reminds me of my own teaching, is that early on, if I had those 4 standouts, like, those would be the stories I would tell to elevate my teaching practice. But I realized it was like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, Star Trek 2 reference. But it was like I was getting so fixated on sort of those home run moments. Then there's the baseball reference, so the episode can be released. I was so fixated on those that the narrative, I was controlling the narrative, that my social justice work was these courageous conversations, and I could highlight these 3 or 4 great insights that student gifted and shared. But I said, but in the long run, how many students did I alienate by simply having conversation in which I was always talking, and if I wasn't talking, there was always the expectation that I would be the first to respond. And in that reflection, it's made me a much more poignant teacher, I think, never to ascend that I'm on a mountaintop. But I look back and I said, when Pav and I were talking about the resources you're sharing, This gets people beyond simply saying I'm having a courageous conversation. And that's critical and that's important. But if that's the only piece, I fear more so by just being reflective that my courageous conversations probably alienated more than it elevated. And I needed more tools. I wanted more, probably actually early on, I didn't even know I needed more tools. Now, you talked about that perfectly. Different accessibility points, access points. How can I engage in this work? And how can the work not simply be about conversation? Because I think as a teacher, conversation's my wheelhouse. And so, charisma, whether it's a trait or whether it's a skill or whether it's a positive or negative, but I know as a teacher, I've relied on charisma. So a courageous conversation, I could dictate, I could control, but teachers can be charismatic in their space, not necessarily through their ability to control a conversation. So how does that charisma manifest? And so that's sort of a little random on that. But when I think of the value of those resources, I think it's valuable because it provides people access points, but I think it gets past the simple talking point of my anti-racist work is always a conversation. It's always a conversation. Important, but there's more components to it. You can dive on that. If I've misrepresented something, go for it, because I would love to continue to learn.
For me, I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit just about what you said in terms of having these conversations, which I think are hugely important. But I think it does take a lot to kind of reflect and say, hey, am I alienating people in this conversation? Which I don't think enough people are doing. So I think that's a great thing, that's something that you're even putting out there. And I think people who are listening are going to be like, okay, am I doing that? But I think that when I reflect on some of the tickets, like the exit tickets or whatever I was trying to create, or as I was trying to call it, action ticket, that was the piece is that I wanted people to sit in reflection, plan something, and then do something, right? Because I think that I'm such a huge person on reflection. I think because we have to really sit in those uncomfortable moments where we're like, oh my gosh, I did this lesson today. And it's so easy to be like, well, the kids aren't structured, the kids are distracted, and the family's this, and all these different things that you kind of will hear, right? Like in a staff room, you'll hear all these different conversations. And it's like, but where is the point where we're talking about what we're doing? What do I need to do next? So a lot of the things, and I think again, it comes back to anti-racist pedagogy and really learning from Day when he talks about action oriented. So I'm always trying to infuse some form of action that is educator action versus always, projecting it onto the admin's not doing this, we don't have enough funding. All of these things are true, but it's but what can we do with what we have, I think is so essential.
Yeah. And I think that that's so key. Even, when you were talking about sitting with the reflections and sitting with the conversations that have had. And I think that that processing time is key to becoming action oriented. And I think that Chey, just to reflect back on what you were talking about in terms of the courageous conversations, that they're so easily led, and I can do that, and I can control that situation, I can be in that space. But even for those students that are not, that you think are not actively participating, they might still be, and I was that kid, they might still be actively listening and absorbing and then reflecting later on. And I'm still that person in many situations where we are having courageous conversations. I'm a listener, but my listening is very active in the sense that I'm taking what has been said and I'm processing it and I'm battling with it on my own and with my own lived experiences. Judy, I wanted to thank you for saying that statement. We don't honor lived experiences enough because they are so valuable, and to eliminate sort of that hierarchy that exists in the school system, we need to be able to take those lived experiences that teachers have in their own spaces with the kids that are in front of them, because they know those students the best, and help them develop those action pieces that are really going to be able to instill that change. So those were just a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that I was able to reflect on before Chey moved on to the next question. I think that processing time is so key in between that courageous conversation and then becoming action oriented, and then really valuing those lived experiences that we all have, but sometimes, as classroom teachers, we don't have the time, the privilege of time, yes, to be able to create those real action pieces that are really going to help to move things along in our system. Chey, do you remember what the question was that you were working towards?
I do, but I'm still reflecting on.
Yeah.
I'm reflecting on what you're saying, and then I'm just pondering my own teaching journey, and I realize as I continued to use courageous conversations, I realized, similar to you, Pav, that just because you spoke didn't mean you were engaged in the content or not. In fact, maybe even think that the people that spoke simply heard. Like when I think of me as a teacher in a staff meeting and they say, everyone share their ideas, I realize you don't want my idea at all. You are waiting for the one teacher to say the one buzzword that you can go on your predetermined rant. And so, which is what I do all the time. But I was just thinking is that the same thing happens in this dynamic as well, that students are engaged in the conversation. A lot of them are just waiting for the single word and they just go off on a tangent, and it dictates the flow of the classroom. And I realized that as a teacher, I needed to have students multiple different access points and time to reflect and come back to conversation. So their voice in the conversation maybe wasn't even heard through dialogue. Maybe they wrote a poem about it. And I realized that when I expanded my definition of what a courageous conversation was, it was part of that good pedagogy for myself. Because I think when people hear courageous conversation, they just mean a conversation in a 30-minute block. And I know now if I drop courageous conversation, I mean, if the conversation may be this period, but the time we dive into the content and the spaces we give students to access that content and share expands. And I think that floats around the idea of safe space or brave space, that I would have thought that I was creating a safe space because I was in such complete charge of the room. Of course it's safe, but it's not safe. In fact, I would always have, as we've talked about, that the more I announce how safe a space is, the more the students that feel unsafe are alienated to speak up because, wait, the teachers told me it's safe. I can't challenge a teacher that says safe, which is why this is some of the vernacular I've completely dropped. It's so erroneous for a teacher to comment on safety because ultimately there's no one safer in that room than myself. So who am I to drop that vernacular? But so I'm glad, Pav, you talked about your experience in those courageous conversations, that just because I'm quiet or mellow, to use a character trait, doesn't mean I'm not engaged in the conversation, doesn't mean I'm not learning in the conversation. And I think I, as a teacher early on, looked those really low resolution look for us to know who is accessing these courageous conversations. And you don't need to speak loudly and first in a courageous conversation to display your level of learning. Pav, now that I've already talked too much, I'll go into this question 4 because it looks like you don't want to ask it, but that's fine.
I actually can't ask it.
So, Judy, Pav and I feel like we're committed to social justice work. I feel like our work is entrenched in social justice work, but I'm always very hesitant. In fact, I'm always hesitant to call myself a social justice warrior or advocate or ally because I feel it's too easy a title to give myself as a white male. Because no matter how much I feel like I'm doing the work, at some point, everyone gives me a pass. I can get off the clock, even no matter how hard I want to be on the clock. People aren't coming to me for resources. People aren't coming to me for questions. No one's texting me at 9 o'clock to talk about indiscretion. So I can parade around the school as such. And I think of my own journey. I would identify early on teaching in a completely racialized community, first completely naive, and then I shifted into savior mode. And then I shifted into center myself mode. And I think I'm outside of that mode. I'm growing away from that mode. In fact, I could almost think I'm completely away from that mode, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a social justice warrior. I don't want to take that title because I feel that there are folks from my learning and listening, that there are people, yourself included, Pav included, that are doing the work and don't get a pass. They're not given a chance to disconnect from the work. There's always a pressure, explicit or sort of floating around in the space, like this aura, this vibe that Judy's going to do this work. Judy's going to speak on this. I can reach out to Judy at 10 o'clock at night because I've had this issue. I've had this battle with a student. Judy's going to mediate this for me. I guess my question is more of a statement. As a white male, one, I don't want to assert that label for myself. And I don't think I've earned it. I would, as I tell Pav, I don't got the receipts for that. But I'm still committed to the work. But I also am aware that I get to relax whenever I want. No one puts these pressures on me socially to be a social justice warrior. The convenience, the safety to be able to be a social justice warrior when I want. And I try to make sure that I disrupt when it's not just convenient. But even then, I look and I listen. I said, it's not the same. I think of teachers on our staff that I've had a really poignant conversation, Pav. We talked about this in one of our episodes, that the teacher came up to me and said, I really love what you said. It said, I want you to know I could never have said that. I would never have been allowed to speak like that. And that was probably the big shift for me in my school. I said, because I always thought that my voice was booming in the staff room and everyone loved what I had to say and everyone loved how I could curate conversations. But I realized, no, even though people would appreciate what I was saying, it was an eye-opener for me to be told, listen, we don't all get to speak like this in social justice work. It's a little different. So with you, how do you find joy? And we talk about Goldie Mohammed talked about joy is resilience is joy. Being able to take a break is finding joy. How are you able to, can you take a break? And how much burden is sort of a white male like myself putting on you endlessly when we don't even know it? Maybe even the way I'm talking in this conversation, in this interview, is putting an undue pressure on you that I'm unaware of. So as it's very all over the place with my question, but as a white male in this space and as a Black woman in this space, how do I be more aware of what's going on?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I think it's around expectation. Like my whole thing is that, okay, so in all, so much of the work, especially like in like educational spaces, it becomes like using language like, this is going to be a uncomfortable conversation, or there's going to be discomfort, or doing this work is hard. And there's a lot of that where I'm like, once you do that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not always true. It's, of course, this work is not always easy, but like you said, there are more moments of joy. Like resistance to me brings me pride, right? Like, so when I'm able to resist a system, when I'm able to interrupt something that I know is wrong, there is a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment there. So for me, doing anti-racist work it is draining, but it's also sustaining. A lot of times I'm tired, but then sometimes it's energizing. Like I remember when I was in the union role, like some of the meetings we would have, like there was so much joy in those spaces, right? Like there was a lot of like, oh my gosh, we got to strategize for this, we have to strategize for that. But there was humor. There was people's personalities come out. Like it's not just all like, toiling, and it's not just drudgery, right? But I think for me as a Black woman, what bothers me is the expectation that this is my work to do. And I think anybody who truly understands anti-racist work or anti-oppressive work is that, it's literally the job of the oppressors to do this work, right? Like when I'm doing it, it's because I know that my life depends on it, right? I also know that I'm advocating for people who are coming after me, or for people who are currently in spaces where I can see that they do have a voice, but they are being silenced, they're being excluded, right? So I see it as like part of my duty. And like I said, I take pride in that, but I think it becomes problematic for me when people have expectations that I'm going to do it. And it's like the simple example of being in a school and always the expectation as a Black person that I'm going to run the Black History Month events, right? And it's like, there's joy working with students, and it's like they get to shine, they get to, be celebrated, they get to, take leadership roles. So of course I love that. But I also feel like if there are 100 people on staff and then there's like 5 Black, not even all teachers, right? So it might be like we're, people from different job categories. There might be 5 of us, maybe 6 of us, but I'm like, but we have a staff of 100. So where's everybody else when it's Black History Month, right? So that's just one example where, again, if we're truly, doing anti-racist work, we're building solidarity, right? So that I want to be involved in what you're doing. You should want to be involved because these are all our students and we serve all of our students and their families, right? So I think that's the issue for me. And I just don't like when it becomes a burden of representation where like, it's like, oh, well, if I don't do it, then it's kind of like, well, Judy's slacking because she doesn't want to she doesn't want to take on this yet another thing to put on her plate. And I think for me, I just want people to really see that it's everybody's work, in terms of like building a better world. But if we really, I don't want to contradict myself because I kind of said it's the work of the oppressor, but I just think that we know that intellectually it's the work of the oppressor because they've created these systems. But I think the reality that we understand is that oppressors benefit most from these systems. So why would they dismantle them? And that's kind of why I'm still here doing the work, is because I know it's not my job. I know it's not my work. But if I don't participate on some level, then things are, we're just going to maintain and reinforce the status quo, or things are going to get worse. And we see how, certain movements are happening all over the world, and things can be getting worse if we all just kind of sit back and say, it's not my work. So I think that's kind of how I feel. But I do think in particular, Black women people have a huge expectation, right? Like, even if we look at like the elections in the United States, it's always like, oh, Black women are going to come out and save us again. It's the Black women who voted, and and then when all the data comes out, it's always like, yeah, Black women did their job, but people need to get on board. But it's kind of like, it's just that expectation. Like, I don't really have to do anything because they're a culture of resistance. They're a culture of struggle. So they're used to activism. So
Right.
let them do it. No.
Yeah. It's sort of like that whole, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? Like if you're doing all the work, then you have to deal with all of the burden of it. And then if you sit back and say, you know what, I'm going to take this opportunity to rest. The nap ministry is been like phenomenal. I have that book still. Rest is Resistance is a book that's in my TBR pile, and I've been meaning to get to it, but I've been doing a lot of reading about, resisting that hustle culture, and that, that you have to do it because you're the only one that has to do it, and you're the only one that can do it. But then you're burning yourself out. Or if you sit back and say, well, why is this always falling on me? And then the oppressor wins in that situation because they get to put it on you and say, just like you said, Judy's being lazy, or, whoever is being lazy. And so it reminds me, actually, Chey and I have been doing some learning at the Urban Indigenous Education Center as part of the TDSB. And we had the opportunity to read a book. And actually, I had an opportunity to listen to Dr. Susan Dion. She wrote the book called Braided Learning. And in it, she talks about the idea of the perfect stranger. It's this concept and idea of a person who says, well, I don't know how to do this work, so I'm going to sit back. I haven't done this learning. I'm going to do it wrong.
Yeah.
I don't have the lived experience. I don't have the knowledge and understanding. And so I need to step back because I can't do it. And so for me, that reminds me, what you are talking about reminds me exactly of that, of being the perfect stranger. And too many people get to just claim that title and be like, you know what, I'm just going to step back and let the people who know what they're doing just do their thing. And to me, that was such an aha moment. That was for me a big learning point. And I've been really actively doing my part to not only learn about this whole idea, but also position myself within that, because I am a person of color. But I'm a person of color who has a lot of proximity to whiteness. As a South Asian first generation Canadian of immigrant parents who were welcomed to Canada and were expected to do all of these things, and they were given the opportunities to do those things. And so for me to not take on this work just because I've put myself in the category of a person of color, and so I'm automatically get a bunch of check marks on my list. And so that for me, I've been doing a lot of work in positioning myself and who I am and where I fit in this narrative, and what work have I been doing? What action have I been? Because it's not enough for me to just say I'm a Sikh South Asian woman, and therefore check. What am I actually doing? And so I feel like sometimes there are certain groups of people who do get a little bit of a pass. Chey talks about, like, I can't take on that. I can't say that I am one of those people that is doing all of this social justice work, because there are so many. But I often wonder, do people like me get put into that category of they are those people when they don't necessarily deserve to be positioned as such? So that's part of the work that I am doing, and much of what you are talking about with us, Judy, today is adding and giving me more to reflect on, and so that I can be more comfortable with my positionality and who I am as a person. So thank you for that. I don't know if you wanted to reflect on anything there, or if you're okay with us moving on to the last question of our interview today.
No, I appreciate just kind of really the fact that you're both kind of bringing in your social locations, because I think that is an important discussion. But again, we all are finding our own way in terms of like, and again, it's that same stream of, or that same one string of like that reflection piece, right? Like all the work that we're doing, it's just different iterations, right? Like every time we have a thought, we have a conversation, we pick up a book, we're just adding and adding and adding. And then I'm hoping that, again, that it still always leads to that action piece, right? And I think just, again, having these conversations for other people to listen, like who knows what's happening when people are listening, right? And so I thank both of you for like being so open with like, those distinctions, because not everybody's saying that. Some people like to hide in the ambiguity, right? It's like, okay, I'm a racialized
Yes.
person, so therefore I know you're not talking to me, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, you know what? We all have we all have a part to play. And we all, like, for example, I know that there's certain privileges that I have just even by having an education or the salary
Yeah.
that I make. So again, I think I'm also thinking, right? So even as a Black person, I'm also thinking about, okay, like how am I entering a particular space? How much space am I taking up, right? Like even
Right.
as a teacher, like we're so used to, like you said, like being able to hold a conversation, to have that charisma. But again, when are we, sitting back and just kind of saying, okay, maybe this is not my time, right, to take up space. Maybe it's my time to listen and to learn and to create my own plan over here. Or to build coalition, or to have conversations with other people and to build a plan with others, right? Versus always just being like, hey, I'm going to go in the front, or I'm going to hide because you couldn't be talking about me. I have nothing to do. Like I have nothing to learn because I have 5 marginalized identities. Therefore, I can just sit here and do nothing. Like that's not
Right.
the message. That's not the takeaway. So
Yeah. And that's this whole conversation, Judy, has just been full of insight. And I know that I'll be going back and listening again. And I know that our listeners will also take away so many poignant points from this conversation. So we just really wanted to thank you. But before we end off our evening, because we've already taken up so much of your evening tonight, but what's next? What's next for Judy McKeown? What are you? Is there something that you're working on? Is there a project in the works? What have you got going on? Tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
well, it's so funny because like right now, like it's just such a time of trying to align with like where I need to be. And I think for me now, I'm just like using spaces. I'm going to be saying spaces like 5 times in this conversation, but I'm really looking for a space where I can be authentic and where I can kind of truly have opportunities to really disrupt, right? And I just think that it gets very difficult like whenever there's a particular title that is assigned to whatever it is that you're doing. So for me, I'm really just kind of searching. I'm searching for a place to land where I can continue to grow, learn from other people and not just other educators, but again, really have opportunities to work in and with community, and to finally have opportunities to maybe be in a different role where I'm learning from students in a different way. Like, because again, you learn from your students as a classroom teacher, but I find like being in a different role, it's like, wow, like what students will say to you when you're not their teacher is like it's so like there's so much that you can take away from that. So I'm trying to think if I have any upcoming projects, but it's more for me, I'm just kind of on a journey of like, where should I go next? Because I remember like I was I had a department at like my previous school, that like the last school I worked at, and I was leaving for another opportunity, and like somebody on the staff came up to me and they're like, Judy, like I know that you like to like leave every like few years, like you like to kind of, because I had said something to them just around like, because English, it's so centered on books and like a certain type of like curriculum. I'm like, I can't be in a place for too long, because then I feel like I myself am going to kind of be stagnant, right? And then I'm going to get comfortable, and that means I'm not learning. It means I'm not challenging like the students if I'm just kind of like doing the same thing. And so I think, I kind of have taken that to heart. So I feel like I'm always trying to look for another space where I can learn and grow, and then hopefully be useful in that space as well, where I'm helping to support other people. So I'm just going to leave it up to the universe is basically what I'm saying. What's next for me is going to be determined by the universe. Yeah.
Dude, I love that last part. Leave it up to the universe. You made a few comments there that make me, again, knowing my position now as a white male, makes me almost want to start a whole nother episode. And I'll just comment it quickly. Maybe it's a teaser for an invite. But you talked about being authentically you, and I've joked with this about Pav. The white male guy, maybe I should be a little careful with my authenticity because it centers my story so much. And it was funny, Pav, I was listening to it wasn't actually my comment. It was sort of my learning where I realized in trying to decenter myself, listening to a bunch of, white male educators and they were talking about just be authentically you. I said, maybe as white and male, we should just check our authenticity first, because perhaps we don't need to wear and display all our cultural things that we love and appreciate all the time, because they're already in everything else around. And so I actually realized, like, I had all my paraphernalia and everything I loved, and I put it all over the room. And I used to thought that was really cool at first, but I've almost started to deconstruct that, because I said, because there's so much me and I'm so comfortable being authentically me that my positionality, especially teaching in a completely racialized community, I felt it was time for me to check my authenticity, not to be authentic in the room, but to make sure that my authenticity didn't lead to narcissism. And so when you brought that up, I think it's really, I thought, reflecting on my journey, that when I just held on to being authentically me, careful for me as a teacher, who am I alienating through my authenticity, and to be a little bit more humble with my authenticity. So I'm glad you brought that up. And this is a perfect teaser for a reunion in about 6 months. But Judy, as Pav said, we want to thank you for gifting us your time and your insights and all the material you're putting out there. And assuredly, you have impacted the way Pav and I teach and the way Pav and I conduct our new roles as middle year student success counselors. And one could argue that you've altered our universe through the incredible work you're doing. And we thank you for that. And thank you for joining the Chey and Pav Show.
Oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for that. Like, I'm just, I don't know, I'm blown away to hear those things, because, you do something and you don't know that it's having an impact. So I just really appreciate hearing that, because it just helps me to say, hey, let me keep going. So I appreciate you both. Thank you.
And we really hope that you do keep going with all of your incredible work. And again, from me as well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Get your hands up to the floor.
You're listening to the Chey and Pav Show.
And that episode was truly fire. So many important nuggets to use. And although it is the summertime, we know that if you listen to this episode, you were already geared to get back into the classroom to sort of bring this identity work, this social justice work, this anti-racist mentality into your classroom teaching.
And through the incredible resources that Judy always shares with educators freely, openly, widely, for educators to use in their own classroom spaces, along with the gems that she has shared through this conversation that we just had, such an amazing set of tools that we can infuse into our teaching. And so we are so grateful for Judy to give us all of these little nuggets of wisdom and tools that we can use for our own spaces.
You've been listening to the Chey and Pav Show, teachers talking teaching, and we're so glad you could come and listen to this episode. You can check out all things Chey and Pav at our website,
cheyandpav.com.
Makes
Please
sense,
tune
doesn't
in
it?
there and stay in touch with us on social media. We are always, always happy to chat with you there. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and now on Threads as well.
Oh, really? Another social media space?
Another space for you to manage.
We can do it. Take care. We'll see you next time on the Chey
and Pav Show.